The first bullet hit the SUV at 8:14 in the morning, and nobody, not one person on that street, was ready for what came next. 37-year-old Reed Callahan should have been unlocking his shop. Instead, he was watching a woman bleed out beside a burning vehicle while everyone around him ran in the opposite direction. He ran toward her. Nobody knew why a mechanic would do that. Nobody knew what he used to be. But someone wanted both of them dead before the morning was over, and that someone was already inside the investigation. If you're new here, subscribe and hit that bell so you never miss a story like this one. Drop your city and country in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now settle in. This one doesn't slow down. The morning Reed Callahan's old life found him again, he was arguing with a 12-year-old coffee maker and losing. The machine wheezed, it sputtered. A thin brown stream dribbled into the pot with all the enthusiasm of something dying slowly, which was essentially what it was doing. Reed stood in his kitchen in Black Ridge, Massachusetts, watching it with the particular expression of a man who has accepted a situation he no longer has the energy to fight. "Dad, I know. It smells like burning. It always smells like burning." 8-year-old Hallie appeared in the kitchen doorway wearing one shoe, her backpack hanging off one shoulder, and the expression of someone who had somewhere better to be. She had her mother's eyes, wide and brown, and capable of communicating disappointment with extraordinary efficiency. "We're going to be late," she said. "We're not going to be late." "Last Tuesday you said that, then we were late." "Last Tuesday was a different situation." "You always say that too." Reed abandoned the coffee maker, grabbed his jacket from the chair where it had been living for 3 days, and held open the front door. Hallie walked through it without breaking stride, already pulling her second shoe on as she moved down the porch steps. That was how their mornings worked. They had found a rhythm over the years, a slightly imperfect, slightly chaotic rhythm that looked nothing like the organized household Reed sometimes imagined having, and everything like the household they actually were. Two people navigating the same space, covering for each other's gaps, making it work. They made it work. Reed dropped Hallie at Black Ridge Elementary at 7:52, 8 minutes before the first bell, which Hallie acknowledged with a single nod of grudging approval before vanishing through the front doors without looking back. Reed sat in this pickup truck for a moment after she disappeared. He did that sometimes. Just sat. Just watched the door close behind her. Then he pulled out and drove the 6 blocks to the shop. Callahan Auto sat on the corner of Decker and 5th, wedged between a dry cleaner that had been threatening to go out of business for 4 years and a sandwich place whose owner, a compact Portuguese man named Alvaro, had once given Hallie an entire loaf of bread because she told him she liked the smell of his shop. The garage bay doors were painted red, which Reed had done himself the first winter he owned the place, when business was slow and he needed something to do with his hands. He had owned it for 6 years, bought it with most of what remained after settling the medical bills and the mortgage and everything else that came with a death at 31. His wife Sonia's death, from a cerebral aneurysm that announced itself on a Tuesday afternoon with no warning, no lead-up, nothing that could have been caught. One moment she was there, then she wasn't. Reed had spent a long time not thinking about any of it, which was different from healing, and he knew it. You put it somewhere you could function around. You kept moving. You raised your daughter and fixed other people's cars and got up every morning and made terrible coffee, and that was surviving, which was the best you could sometimes do. The shop opened at 8. By 8:30, he had 2 vehicles in the bay, and his one full-time employee, a lanky 24-year-old named Marcus, who had been working for Reed since dropping out of community college, was already underneath a pickup truck making noises that suggested he had found something expensive. "Brake caliper," Marcus called from under the vehicle. "How bad?" "Needs replacing." "Call the owner." "She's going to be unhappy." "They always are." Reed pulled on his work gloves. "Call her anyway." That was 8:45. At 8:56, the first gunshot split the morning wide open. Reed heard it before he understood it. A sound so specific, so unlike anything else, that his body recognized it 2 full seconds before his conscious mind caught up. He was walking toward the shop's side door when the second shot came, then a third in rapid succession, and by then the screaming had started outside on Decker. Marcus scrambled to his feet, smacking his head on the undercarriage. "What the—" "Stay inside." Reed's voice had changed. Not louder, flatter. The tone came from somewhere he hadn't accessed in years, and it arrived fully formed, like a language you never actually forget. Marcus froze. Reed was already moving. He stepped out the side door and stopped for exactly 2 seconds, long enough to read the situation on the street. What he saw was this. 2 vehicles had been stopped in the middle of Decker. One, a black SUV on its side with smoke coming from the hood. The second, a sedan that had been rear-ended into a fire hydrant. 3 men in dark clothing and masks were positioned at the far end of the block, firing from 2 directions in a pattern that was not random. This was coordinated. Across the street, crouched behind the overturned SUV, a woman in a gray suit was pressing her hand to her side. Blood. Too much of it. She was conscious, but her movements were deteriorating, slowing in the particular way Reed recognized as someone losing the fight against blood loss. People on the sidewalks were running. One security guard was down near a parked car. Another had taken cover behind a concrete planter and appeared to be calling something in. Nobody was moving toward the woman. Reed scanned back toward the cafe, 2 doors down. Hallie's school drop-off was in the opposite direction. She was safe. He had 8 minutes before the attackers finished with the decoys and the window closed. He went. Later, people would ask him what he was thinking when he crossed that street. He was thinking about angles. He was thinking about which of the 3 attackers had the clearest sightline to where the woman was positioned, which one was moving, which one was stationary, and which direction the fire was being coordinated from. He was not thinking about being shot. He was not thinking about being brave. Those were things you thought about afterward, if there was an afterward. The bullet caught his jacket sleeve at the elbow. He felt the tug of it, and a second shot shattered the window of a parked car 3 feet to his left. He kept moving, used the line of stopped vehicles as partial cover, hit the ground behind the SUV, and came up alongside the woman in the gray suit. She was somewhere in her early 30s, dark hair matted with blood on one side of her face, eyes sharp despite everything. Whatever she wasn't panicking. She looked at him the way people look at something unexpected when they're too exhausted to pretend it doesn't surprise them. "There's a man down on your left side," she said immediately. 20 feet. "I see him." Reed was already pulling off his outer shirt, folding it, pressing it hard against the wound on her side. She flinched. He held the pressure. "What's your name?" "Celeste. Celeste Marlowe." The name registered somewhere in the back of his mind. He had seen it on something recently, a business story in a newspaper he'd been using to line the shop's recycling bin, but he didn't pause on it. Reed. He studied the wound. The bullet had gone through her side, high enough to miss the liver, low enough to miss the lung. Painful, significant blood loss. Not immediately fatal if he kept pressure on it and moved her in the next 3 minutes. "Can you walk?" "I can try." "Don't try. Tell me yes or no." A beat. "Yes." "Okay." He looked back toward the service entrance of the hotel behind them. The Aldworth, one of those buildings that took up an entire city block and had 6 different ways in if you knew where to look, which Reed did because he had done a water pump job for their facilities manager 2 months earlier. "We're going to move in about 30 seconds. I need you to stay low and stay on my left side. If I tell you to stop, you stop. If I tell you to move, you don't hesitate. Are we clear?" Celeste looked at him. Something in her expression shifted. Not quite trust, not yet, but a decision. The kind of decision you make when your options have narrowed to one. "Clear," she said. The next attacker came around the back end of the SUV at that exact moment. What happened in the following 8 seconds was not elegant. There was nothing controlled or cinematic about it. It was fast and brutal, and it hurt. Reed came up from the side, caught the man's weapon hand, leveraged the angle, and put him on the ground hard enough that the back of the attacker's head hit the asphalt with a sound that ended the fight immediately. Reed's left shoulder took a hit in the process. Not from a bullet. The attacker's elbow, a solid connection that would bruise deep and slow him on that side for a week. He didn't stop. "Move," he said to Celeste. She moved. They went through the service entrance as bullets punched divots into the doorframe behind them, 3 holes appearing in rapid sequence, plaster dust floating in the corridor light. Celeste was moving faster than Reed had expected, one hand braced against his arm for balance, her other hand pressing his folded shirt tight against her wound. A hotel employee appeared at the end of the service corridor, young, apron, wide-eyed, and Reed pointed at him. Call 911. Tell them you have a gunshot victim inside the building and active shooters on Decker. Tell them there's one attacker down outside near the black SUV. Go." The employee went. Reed guided Celeste to the floor in a recessed alcove off the corridor, positioned so nothing came at them from either direction without warning. She sank against the wall and let out a breath that was not quite a groan, too controlled for that, and looked down at her side. How bad? How bad?" she asked. "You'll live." He replaced his hands over the makeshift pressure bandage. Her suit jacket, he noticed, was probably worth more than his truck. The truck was worth $4,000 on a good day. "But you need a surgeon soon." "There was supposed to be 3 cars," she said. Her voice had a strange quality. Not shock exactly, more like someone working through a math problem. "We had 3 vehicles this morning. The protocol was changed last night." Reed looked at her. "Someone changed your security protocol?" "My head of security said there was a credibility issue with the route. He recommended we consolidate to 1 convoy." She paused. "I approved it." Reed didn't say anything immediately. In his experience, the moments when people most needed someone to tell them it wasn't their fault were also the moments when saying so too quickly produced the opposite effect. "Who knew about the route change?" he asked instead. "My security team. My CFO. My personal assistant." She stopped. "That's it?" "You're sure?" "I approved it at 9 o'clock last night. It went to those 3 people." Reed sat back slightly. The corridor was quiet. He could hear sirens now, distant but closing, and somewhere in the building an alarm was cycling on and off, which meant the hotel's system had registered something. Celeste was watching him. He realized she had been watching him since they came through the door. Not helplessly, but the way someone watches a person they're trying to understand quickly. "Who are you?" she asked. "Exactly." Reed looked toward the corridor entrance. The sirens were getting louder. "Someone with a bad shoulder and a coffee maker that needs replacing." He pressed the fabric tighter against her side. "That's more than enough for now." "You recognize that attack pattern, the way they were positioned?" "I grew up watching a lot of war movies." Celeste's mouth moved slightly. Not quite a smile. More like the involuntary reaction of someone who finds something unexpectedly dry in the middle of a catastrophe. "I see," she said. Outside, the first police units arrived on Decker. Inside the alcove, Reed kept pressure on the wound and watched the corridor and thought about the 3 people who had known about a route change made at 9 o'clock the night before. Thought about the coordinated positioning of 3 armed attackers who had been exactly where they needed to be. Thought about the way the attack had been timed for maximum exposure and minimum interference. He thought about Hallie at school, safe, 8 minutes away. He thought about the fact that whoever planned this morning wasn't finished yet. And then the police found them, and everything that had been violent and simple turned immediately complicated because the first detective through the service door was not looking at Celeste Marlowe the way you look at a victim. He was looking at Reed Callahan the way you look at a suspect. Detective Commander Victor Sloan was the kind of man who wore his authority like an article of clothing, carefully pressed, on purpose, meant to be noticed. He was 51, silver-haired, with the particular smoothness of someone who has spent 2 decades learning how to make a room feel like he'd arrived to clean it up. He extended a hand to Celeste immediately, spoke to her in low, reassuring tones, called her by her first name like he knew her. Then he looked at Reed. "Mr. Callahan." His voice didn't cool exactly. It just adjusted, the way a camera adjusts its focus. "You're the gentleman who brought Ms. Marlowe inside." "That's right." "Your shop is on the corner?" Sloan nodded toward the exterior wall, as if the shop were visible through the concrete. 2 blocks east. 1 block north, 2 blocks east. "And you happened to be outside when the attack began." Reed noted the word. "Happened." "I was going out the side door," Reed said. "I heard the shots." "And instead of taking cover," Sloan tilted his head slightly, "you crossed the street. Someone was hurt." "Someone was hurt." Sloan repeated it the way people repeat things they want you to hear differently the second time. "Most people, Mr. Callahan, when they hear automatic gunfire in the street, they don't cross toward it." "Most people." Sloan studied him. "You served." It wasn't a question. Reed had learned long ago that certain things about a man's posture, his movement, his decision-making under pressure left marks that other people who had served could read the way you read a page. A long time ago, Reed said. Navy, Sloane said, and this time it was a guess. A very specific guess, more specific than the evidence should have supported. Reed filed that away somewhere without reacting to it. We'll want to talk more about that. Across the alcove, Celeste was being seen to by paramedics who had come in through the service entrance. She looked toward Reed once over the shoulder of the medic working on her side. Her expression was unreadable in the way that expressions become when someone is using considerable energy to keep them that way. Reed looked back at Victor Sloane and said nothing more. He had been in enough rooms with men like this to know that the conversation that was just beginning was not the conversation that was actually happening. Outside on Decker, the sirens had stopped. The morning had gone quiet in the particular way that follows disaster. The silence that isn't really silence at all, but the absence of everything that was supposed to be normal. Hallie would be in second period by now. She would not know. Not yet. Reed sat in the alcove with a wounded shoulder, blood on his hands that wasn't his own, and the growing certainty that the most dangerous moment of the morning had not been the gunfire. It was whatever came next. The interrogation room at Blackridge Police Headquarters smelled like old coffee and something faintly chemical. Floor cleaner, maybe. Or the particular scent of a room that had absorbed too many difficult conversations over too many years. It was a small room. 1 table. 3 chairs. A mirror on the wall that wasn't fooling anyone. Reed had been in rooms like this before, though not on this side of the table. He sat with his arms resting in front of him, his wounded shoulder stiff and wrapped in a field dressing. A paramedic had applied quickly before Sloane's people walked him out of the hotel service corridor and into the back of an unmarked vehicle. They had not handcuffed him. Not yet. That was deliberate. A way of keeping things casual, of suggesting this was just a conversation between reasonable people, which was exactly the kind of framing Reed had no intention of accepting at face value. The detective who came in first was not Sloane. It was a younger man named Ferris, late 30s, tired around the eyes, carrying a manila folder and a paper cup of coffee. He sat down without offering Reed any. He sat across the table and opened the folder and looked at it for a moment with the performance of someone reading something they had already memorized. Reed Thomas Callahan, Ferris said, 37. Owner of Callahan Auto on Decker and 5th, single father. He looked up. 1 daughter, Hallie, 8 years old. That's right. And before the shop? Reed had decided on the drive over how he was going to handle this. Not hostility, not performance, just the truth, delivered plainly in the order that served him. Navy, he said, 12 years, separated 4 years after my wife died. Ferris wrote something. What did you do in the Navy? Various things. Ferris looked up again. Mr. Callahan, SEAL teams, Reed said. Teams 3 and 8. I don't have anything to hide about that. It's in whatever file you're about to pull. Ferris set his pen down. He had the expression of someone whose script had just been skipped several pages ahead. Okay, he said slowly. So you understand why we have some questions. I understand why someone has questions, Reed said. I'm less certain those questions are coming from where you think they are. Ferris stared at him. What does that mean? It means I'd like to know who assigned Detective Commander Sloane to this investigation, and when. A pause. Something moved behind Ferris's eyes. Not quite discomfort, but close to it. Sloane leads the Corporate Security Task Force. A crime involving a high-profile CEO falls under his... Who assigned him specifically to this case, Reed said. And when? Before the shooting or after? Ferris closed the folder. He picked up his coffee. He did not answer the question. That was answer enough. They kept Reed for 4 hours. Sloane came in for the last 40 minutes, smooth as always, asking questions in that particular way of his, where the question itself contained the accusation, folded inside the grammar, dressed up as curiosity. How had Reed known where to move? Why had he gone through that specific service entrance? Had he ever had prior contact with Celeste Marlowe or her company? Reed answered everything calmly. He had nothing to hide and he knew it, which made staying calm considerably easier than it might otherwise have been. But he also knew, with the particular certainty of someone who has spent years in environments where people are professionally trying to kill you, that calmness was not going to be enough. Because at 3:07 that afternoon, 2 things happened simultaneously. The first was that Marcus called Reed's cell phone, voice shaking, to tell him that 4 officers had just arrived at Callahan Auto with a warrant. The second was that Sloan walked back into the interrogation room, set a photograph on the table, and said, "We need to talk about what we found in your shop." The photograph showed a small black device, rectangular, no larger than a thumb drive, mounted behind the steel frame of a storage shelf in the shop's back office. "Surveillance equipment," Sloan said, "mounted inside your wall, broadcasting to an external receiver." Reed looked at the photograph. He looked at it for a long time. "That's not mine," he said. "We found it in your building." "I know where you found it. I'm telling you it's not mine." Sloan sat down. He did it slowly, the way people sit down when they want you to feel the weight of what's coming. "We also found a vehicle in your shop, a sedan, delivered 3 days ago for bodywork. The owner is a shell company registered in Delaware that traces back to nothing useful. But inside the vehicle, tucked into the door panel on the driver's side, were documents containing Celeste Marlowe's travel schedule for the next 60 days, including this morning's convoy route." The room went very quiet. Reed kept his voice flat. "Someone delivered a vehicle to my shop and put documents inside it without my knowledge. That's one explanation. It's the correct one. Mr. Callahan." Sloan folded his hands on the table. His voice carried the particular patience of a man who believes he is in control of a situation. "A decorated former Navy SEAL living 2 blocks from where this attack took place. Surveillance equipment inside his shop. Documents containing the victim's schedule found on his premises. He's conveniently present when the attack begins and performs with a level of tactical precision that—" "I saved her life," Reed said. "Or you ensured she survived long enough to appear to have been saved." Sloan let that sit in the air for a moment. "A botched assassination, Mr. Callahan, can be made to look like a rescue. It creates a perfect story. Hero mechanic saves billionaire CEO. Nobody looks at the mechanic." Reed looked at him. He thought about Hallie in her second period class, drawing something or reading something, entirely unaware that her father was sitting in a room being called the man who might have tried to kill someone. He thought about what it would do to her, what it would look like from the outside, what it would feel like to have to explain it. And then he shut that down, because the moment you let fear for the people you love affect your thinking in a room like this is the moment you start making mistakes. And Reed Callahan could not afford mistakes right now. "I want a lawyer," he said. Sloan nodded, as if this confirmed something. "Of course." They released him 3 hours later, not because they were satisfied, but because they didn't have enough to hold him without formal charges, and filing formal charges required a DA sign-off that apparently hadn't come through yet. Sloan walked him to the building exit himself, which was a choice that didn't need to be explained. "Stay available," Sloan said at the door. "Where would I go?" Reed said. He walked out into the late afternoon and stood on the sidewalk for a moment, breathing the cold air, his shoulder throbbing through the field dressing. His truck was still at the shop. He called a cab. While he waited, he called Marcus. "They took the sedan," Marcus said. His voice had stabilized somewhat, but the underlying agitation was still there. "And they bagged a whole bunch of stuff from the back office." "Reed, there was a camera back there. I swear to you I never saw it. I work in that office. I have never—" "I know," Reed said. "I know you didn't." "Who put it there?" "Someone who knew the shop." Reed watched a bus go by on the street. "Someone who needed me to look guilty." The silence on Marcus's end stretched out. Then, "Reed, that's serious." "Yeah," Reed said. "It is." The cab came. Reed got in and told the driver to take him to Blackridge Elementary first. He needed to see his daughter's face before he figured out what came next, and that was not a strategic calculation. It was simply the one thing he needed, and he had learned the hard way not to argue with those. Hallie came out through the school's front doors at 3:50, spotted him beside the cab, and changed her pace immediately. She read faces the way some kids read words, quickly, intuitively, with a comprehension that went beyond what she was supposed to be capable of at 8. "What happened to your shoulder?" she said. "I hurt it this morning." "At the shop?" Reed crouched down to her level. He had a version of the truth he was going to tell her. Edited for age, edited for the fact that she should be able to sleep tonight. And he was about to deliver it when Hallie did the thing she did sometimes, which was look at him with those brown eyes and say exactly the thing that collapsed whatever careful structure he had built.
"Were you in the thing on Decker Street?" she said. "Everyone's talking about it. Jalen's mom texted Jalen in class, which is not allowed, but Miss Tarver didn't notice. There were shooters." Reed sat with that for a second. "Yeah," he said. "I was nearby." "Were you scared?" "A little, after." She considered this.
"That's when scared usually happens," she said, with the gravity of someone making an important philosophical observation. Then she got in the cab, and Reed got in after her, and they drove to the shop in a silence that was full of things neither of them said. He was not going to tell her the rest tonight. That he had been questioned, that someone had planted evidence in his shop, that there was a man in a good suit who was building a picture of Reed Callahan that bore no resemblance to anything real. Tonight she needed dinner and homework and her father sitting at the kitchen table. That was what he could give her, and he gave it. But he did not sleep. He sat in the kitchen after Hallie went to bed and thought about everything he knew, arranging it the way he used to arrange tactical information, by reliability, by sequence, by what each piece implied about the larger structure. What he knew, 3 attackers, coordinated, with the knowledge of a route change made 14 hours earlier. A sedan delivered to his shop 3 days ago by a company that didn't exist. Surveillance equipment installed inside his wall, which required someone to be inside his shop at a time when he wasn't there. Sloan, who had been on this case so fast and so focused that the timing didn't fit a normal call-out. What he suspected, someone had been watching his routine for long enough to know when his shop would be empty. Someone had access to Celeste Marlowe's inner circle, and whoever it was had built the frame around Reed with a patience that suggested this hadn't been improvised. It had been prepared. He had been selected, which meant that before the shooting happened, someone had looked at Reed Callahan, his military record, his address, his 2-block proximity to the convoy route, and decided he was the perfect person to carry the blame. That thought kept him in the kitchen until 2 in the morning, at which point he made himself stop, because sitting in a dark room building theories you can't yet prove does nothing except exhaust you, and exhausted people make bad decisions. He went to bed. He did not sleep well. He was not surprised. Across the city, in a private room at Blackridge General Hospital, Celeste Marlowe was awake. She had been awake for most of it, actually. The surgery, the recovery room, the transfer to the private wing, not awake in the literal sense, but awake in the sense that the mind keeps working even when the body is being physically repaired, running its own parallel processes. She had a morphine drip she had asked the nurse to reduce twice because she did not want to be imprecise. Precision was, at this moment, the thing she needed most. Her personal assistant, Dana, 26, efficient, visibly shaken in a way she was trying to conceal, sat in the corner chair with a laptop and a phone, fielding the calls that were stacking up. Board members, investors, legal, her PR team, whose primary interest appeared to be the narrative. Celeste let Dana handle all of it. She was thinking about the route change. She was thinking about the 3 people who had known, her security chief, her CFO, her assistant. Dana had known. Dana was sitting in this room right now and had been the first person through the door when Celeste came out of recovery, face pale, hands wristed together in her lap. Did that mean Dana was clear? No. It meant Dana was present. Those were different things. Her CFO was Graham Voss, who had been with the company 11 years, who had sat across from Celeste in the boardroom in every major financial decision the company had made in the last decade. He was thorough, meticulous, the kind of financial mind that other financial minds found slightly annoying because he was rarely wrong. He also, Celeste now remembered, had a new house, a very significant house in a very significant neighborhood, that he'd purchased 8 months ago and attributed to an inheritance she had never thought to verify. She hadn't thought to verify it because you don't interrogate your CFO's inheritance. You trust the people you've chosen to trust because if you don't, you can't function. She had been wrong. She didn't know that yet. Not for certain, but the shape of it was forming. At 9 in the evening, she asked Dana to get her the company's financial access reports for the last 2 years. Dana blinked. Celeste, you just had surgery. I'm aware of that. The board is sending a statement. I don't need the statement. I need the access reports. She paused. Please. Dana looked at her with the expression of someone who has learned that arguing with Celeste Marlowe is an exercise in very polite futility. She opened the laptop. What Celeste found over the next 4 hours, working in careful increments between the nurse's check-ins, resting when she had to, returning to the screen when she could, was not a single smoking document. It was a pattern. The kind of pattern that only becomes visible when you know what to look for and are willing to follow the threads back far enough. Money moving through subsidiary accounts in ways that were technically within protocol but practically inexplicable. Vendor contracts that had been approved at the CFO level without the usual dual authorization. Discrepancies in quarterly reports that were individually minor, rounding errors, she might have said, if she'd been paying less attention, but collectively significant. Collectively very, very significant. Hundreds of millions of dollars. Moving slowly, over 2 years, in increments small enough to avoid triggering automated alerts but large enough that the cumulative figure was staggering. Celeste set the laptop aside and stared at the ceiling. She had a board meeting scheduled in 6 days. She had been, before this morning, before the gunfire and the overturned SUV and the mechanic who had crossed a street toward bullets, about to initiate an audit. A quiet one. Preliminary. She had not told anyone about it yet because she didn't have enough to bring to the board with confidence. Someone had known, anyway. That was the thing that settled like cold water through her. She hadn't told anyone. She hadn't put it in writing. She had made one phone call to an external audit firm, routed through her personal phone, not the company line, and scheduled a preliminary consultation. Someone had known anyway, which meant either the audit firm was compromised, or someone had been monitoring her personal communications, or she had said something out loud in the wrong place at the wrong time. She thought about her office, her phone, the car she used for private meetings. She thought about surveillance equipment. She thought about a mechanic's shop on Decker Street where someone had placed a camera behind a steel shelf. And she started to understand that the frame they had built around Reed Callahan had not been designed only to protect the people stealing from her company. It had been designed to point investigators away from the investigation she had been about to begin, to redirect every available resource toward a convenient suspect, so that by the time the real story became visible, the money would be gone and the people who moved it would be too far ahead to catch. She reached for her phone. It was almost midnight. She called her private legal counsel, not the company's attorneys, her personal one, a woman named Birch who had worked with Celeste for 9 years and picked up on the second ring. "I need you to come to the hospital," Celeste said. "Bring someone from outside, not company affiliated, not Blackridge connected." She thought for a moment. "And I need everything you can find on a Reed Callahan, formerly Navy SEAL, currently running an auto repair shop on Decker and Fifth. I want his service record, his finances, his history, everything. I want it by morning." "Celeste," Birch's voice was steady, careful. "Are you accusing him of something?" "No," Celeste said. "I'm trying to establish that no one else can." She hung up and lay back against the hospital pillow. The morphine drip was at its lowest effective setting, and the wound in her side burned with a dull, insistent presence that she was choosing to treat as information rather than inconvenience. It reminded her she was alive. It reminded her that she had been alive because someone had run across an open street toward Gunfire when every rational calculation argued against it. She thought about what he'd said in the alcove when she'd asked who he was. Someone with a bad shoulder and a coffee maker that needs replacing. She had met thousands of people. She had sat across negotiating tables from executives, politicians, financiers, people who made a career out of projecting exactly the quality they wanted you to see. She was good at reading the performance. Reed Callahan had not been performing. That was, she thought, either the most compelling evidence of his innocence or the most sophisticated deception she had ever encountered. She was betting on the former, and she was almost never wrong about people, and she was completely aware that almost never was not the same as never. But she was betting on the former. The night nurse came in at 12:30 to check vitals and found Celeste with her laptop open, a yellow legal pad balanced on her knee, and a handwritten list of subsidiary company names that she had cross-referenced against the vendor contracts. "Ms. Marlowe," the nurse said with genuine exhaustion, "you had surgery 10 hours ago." "I know. You should be sleeping." "I'll sleep when I've finished." The nurse looked at the legal pad, then at the IV, then at Celeste. "I'm going to get you some water," she said finally, because it was the only intervention available to her. "That would be wonderful," Celeste said, and turned back to the screen. The morning came gray and cold. Reed dropped Hallie at school. She watched him from the sidewalk as the truck pulled away. That specific look on her face she got when she knew more than she was saying, and drove to the shop. Half of what had been in the back office was gone. The spaces where equipment had been were marked with evidence tape in shapes that looked almost abstract, like someone had tried to define the outline of things that were no longer there. Marcus was standing in the bay with his arms crossed, trying to look useful in the absence of anything obvious to do. "One of the cars we had in is still sitting outside," Marcus said. "Owner called. She wants to know when she can pick it up." "Tell her today," Reed said. "We're not closing." "Reed, we're not closing." He said it without heat, just fact. Closing would look like guilt, and closing would leave Marcus without a paycheck, and both of those things were unacceptable. He pulled on his work gloves and went to look at the car in the bay. At 9:40, his phone rang. He didn't recognize the number, but the area code was local, so he picked it up. "Mr. Callahan." A woman's voice, precise, measured, with a quality that suggested she was used to managing conversations without losing control of them. "My name is Adrienne Birch. I'm legal counsel for Celeste Marlowe. She asked me to contact you." Reed leaned against the side of the car. "Is she all right?" "She's in stable condition." A brief pause, the kind that meant something was being assessed. "She also asked me to tell you that she's reviewed your service record, your financial history, and as much of your background as we were able to compile in 8 hours. And she is satisfied that the accusation against you is constructed." Reed said nothing for a moment. "She investigated me." "She did?" "In the hospital, after surgery." "Yes." Another pause that might have contained something like amusement, though it was buried deep. "She's thorough." Reed exhaled. He turned to look at the evidence tape on the back office wall. "What does she need from me?" "She needs to speak with you directly," Birch said. "Today, if possible. Not at the hospital, somewhere she can be confident the conversation isn't monitored." "She thinks her hospital room is being monitored." "She thinks it's possible." Birch's voice was careful. "Given the events of yesterday, she's treating assumption of privacy as a liability." Reed looked at his watch. It was 9:47. He thought about the sedan sitting in the impound lot and the camera behind his shelf, and the document with Celeste's convoy schedule tucked into a door panel. He thought about how much preparation it had taken to build the frame around him, how many days of observation, how many decisions, how many people. He thought about the fact that whoever had built it had access to Celeste's inner circle, and he thought about what it meant that she was already looking past the attack, past the surgery, past the shock of nearly dying, and straight into the machinery of what had happened. "Tell me when and where," he said. But they met at Alvaro's sandwich shop at 11:30. Birch had chosen it, which told Reed she had done some local research. It was the kind of place where nobody important ate, which made it exactly the kind of place where an important conversation wouldn't draw attention. Celeste arrived in a private car, moving carefully but under her own power, her side bandaged under a dark blazer that she had clearly chosen for coverage rather than appearance. She looked pale and deliberate, and like someone who had slept approximately 3 hours. She slid into the booth across from Reed and looked at him with the directness of someone who has decided not to spend any time on preamble. "Thank you for coming," she said. "Thank you for the investigation," he said. She didn't look apologetic. "I needed to be certain." "I know." He meant it. "I would have done the same." Alvaro appeared at the table with menus neither of them requested and an expression of mild alarm at Celeste, who he clearly recognized from the news coverage that had been running since the previous morning. Reed gave him a look that communicated "please don't," and Alvaro left the menus and retreated with the diplomacy of a man who understood that sometimes the right move is to bring coffee and ask nothing. Celeste put a photograph on the table. It was printed on regular paper, rushed, slightly low resolution. It showed a financial transfer document with a column of routing numbers. "This money started moving 14 months ago," she said. "Small amounts, routed through 3 subsidiary accounts. It's been accelerating over the last quarter." She tapped the paper. "I didn't notice because I wasn't looking for it. The accounts were structured specifically to stay below the threshold that triggers my automated oversight system." Reed looked at the document. Numbers, routing codes. He was not a financial analyst, but he understood pattern recognition. "How much total?" "My estimate, based on what I found last night, is somewhere between $200 and $260 million. I won't know the exact figure until I can access the full audit records. The coffee Alvaro brought sat between them untouched. Who has access to those accounts? Reed asked. My CFO controls subsidiary account authorization at the executive level. Graham Voss. She said the name the way you say a name when you have recently had to reclassify someone you trusted, carefully, without inflection. He would have needed help routing funds without triggering internal alerts. That means someone with system-level access to our compliance software. Which someone would have. The security division, she said. The team that built our internal monitoring system has administrator credentials that can, under specific circumstances, flag certain transactions for manual review rather than automatic processing. She paused. Victor Sloan's corporate task force consulted on that system's design 18 months ago. Reed sat with that for a moment. Sloan was inside your system, he said. His team had access, she said. I approved it as part of a security audit. It was standard practice. Her jaw tightened slightly. It was standard practice that someone found a way to exploit. And the attack? The attack was supposed to happen before my preliminary audit consultation this week, she said. I had arranged an initial meeting through my personal phone, a private line, nothing connected to company infrastructure, with an external audit firm. The meeting was scheduled for Thursday. The attack happened Tuesday. She looked at him steadily. Someone knew about that consultation. Your personal phone. Yes. Which means either someone had access to your personal communications, or I said something where I could be heard, she said. And I have been through every conversation I can remember from the last 2 weeks. I made that call from my home office. I was alone. Her voice was absolutely level. My home is equipped with a security system provided by my company's security division. The table was quiet. Reed understood what she was saying. He understood the full reach of it. The home security system monitored by the same people who had helped design her company's compliance software, the people connected to Victor Sloan, the people who had routed a sedan to his shop and installed a camera behind his shelf and placed documents in a door panel. The reach of this thing was not limited to one attack on one morning. It had been running for over a year. You're not safe in the hospital, he said. No, she agreed. Probably not. And you can't go home. Also correct. Birch is outside? In the car. Reed looked at the routing numbers on the page in front of him. He thought about everything he had put away when he left the Navy. The skills, the instincts, the particular mode of thinking that treated every environment as a problem to be mapped and controlled. He had put it away on purpose. He had put it away because Hallie needed a father who came home from the shop with grease on his hands and complaints about the coffee maker, not a father who scanned exit routes when he walked into a room. But he had not put it away because it stopped being useful. He had put it away because it was too useful, because it had a way of becoming the primary thing if you let it, and he had decided that Hallie needed to be the primary thing. He looked up at Celeste. She was watching him with the same focused attention she had had the day before in the hotel alcove. Not helpless, not waiting to be rescued, but assessing, calculating, making decisions about what resources were available and how to deploy them. She was not someone who needed saving in the ordinary sense. She needed someone who could work alongside her in the space where her resources ended and a different kind of knowledge began. Tell me everything you found last night, he said. Everything, in sequence. Celeste picked up her coffee. She started talking. Outside, Blackridge moved through its Tuesday morning with no knowledge of what was sitting in a sandwich booth 2 tables from the window. A wounded billionaire and a mechanic who had once been something else, each of them trying to map the edges of something that was considerably larger than either of them had understood the day before. And in the back corner of the restaurant, a man Alvaro had never seen before sat over a cup of tea. He wasn't drinking and watched and said nothing. He had been there since before they arrived. The man in the corner of Alvaro's sandwich shop left 11 minutes after Reed noticed him. Reed had noticed him at the 8-minute mark, peripherally, the way you notice things when part of your brain never fully stops doing a job you told it to retire from. Dark jacket. Tea he hadn't touched. Positioned with a sightline to the booth and the front entrance simultaneously, which was either coincidence or training, and Reed had stopped believing in coincidence sometime around his 3rd deployment. He didn't say anything to Celeste immediately. He let her finish walking him through the financial trail, The subsidiary accounts, the routing sequences, the vendor contracts that had been approved without dual authorization. And he watched the man in the corner and processed both streams of information in parallel. When the man stood, paid cash, and left without looking at them, Reed said, "We need to move." Celeste stopped mid-sentence. She read his face. Someone was watching us. Corner table, dark jacket, been here since before we arrived. She didn't turn to look. Did he hear us? Not at this distance, in this noise level, but he confirmed we met. Reed folded the routing document she had printed and slid it into his jacket pocket. Which means someone is tracking your movements, not just your phone. You. Birch appeared in the doorway from the street. She had seen the man leave, apparently, because her expression when she entered carried the specific quality of someone recalibrating a threat assessment. She crossed to the booth quickly. "We should go," she said. "Yes," Celeste said. She was already sliding out of the booth, one hand pressed briefly to her side, where the movement pulled at something that wasn't ready to be pulled at. She kept her face neutral through it, which Reed noticed, and she noticed him noticing, and neither of them commented on it. Alvaro appeared from behind the counter with a brown paper bag. "I wrapped something," he said to Reed, in the tone of a man who does not ask questions and expects the same courtesy in return. "For the little one." "Thanks, Alvaro," Reed said. They left through the back. The question of where to put Celeste was solved, temporarily and imperfectly, by Reed's own house. It was not an elegant solution. He was aware of that. A one-story house in a residential neighborhood in Blackridge, with a coffee maker that smelled like burning and a backyard that was mostly dead grass and a swing set Hallie had outgrown, but that neither of them had gotten around to taking down. It was not a safe house in any professional sense of the term, but it had certain practical advantages. It was registered in Reed's name, not Celeste's. It had no connection to Marlowe Global's security infrastructure. Nobody had installed a camera in it. Reed had checked methodically every room, every fixture, every corner, the evening before. And it sat on a residential street where a strange car parked outside would be noticed by the retired woman 3 doors down who noticed everything and told everyone. Celeste stood in the living room and looked around with an expression that was not quite what Reed had expected. Not discomfort, not the particular brand of polite tolerance that wealthy people sometimes deployed in unfamiliar environments. More like someone who had walked into a room and found it unexpectedly legible. A space where the evidence of actual living was just sitting there, unedited. Hallie's school drawings were taped to the wall beside the television. A half-completed jigsaw puzzle occupied one end of the coffee table. There were 2 different sizes of shoes by the front door, a child's sneaker and a work boot, sitting together in the way shoes sit when people have stopped performing and just live. "The guest room is down the hall," Reed said. "Clean sheets. The shower works, but the hot water takes about 90 seconds to arrive." "That's fine." She turned from the drawings. "Reed, you don't have to." "I know I don't have to." She looked at him directly. "Thank you. I'm not good at saying it simply, so I'm saying it simply. Thank you." He nodded. He went to make coffee, which took longer than it should have because the coffee maker was waging its slow, ongoing war against functionality, and Celeste sat at the kitchen table and opened her laptop and kept working, because Celeste Marlowe apparently did not have a mode that wasn't working. Birch had gone to set up a secure channel with the external legal team, people she trusted, people with no connection to Blackridge's corporate infrastructure, people who could begin the process of building a case that could go somewhere other than Victor Sloan's desk. That left Reed and Celeste in a kitchen that smelled like burned coffee and a stack of financial documents between them, and a problem that had been growing for 14 months and was now pressing down on both of them with a weight that wasn't abstract anymore. "Walk me through Voss," Reed said, setting a mug in front of her. "Not the financial part. Him. Who is he?" Celeste wrapped her hands around the mug. She looked at it for a moment. "Graham was the most methodical person I've ever worked with. 11 years. He built our compliance architecture from the ground up. He's the reason we've never had a significant audit problem." She paused. "He is also the reason our compliance system has a backdoor that can reroute transactions from automatic review to manual approval. He built the backdoor into his own system." "He built the system," she said, "which means he built everything in it." Her voice was controlled in the way that voices get, when the thing beneath them is something larger than the speaker wants to deal with at this particular moment. I hired him when the company was a third of its current size. He watched it grow. He helped it grow. And he spent the last 14 months emptying it. Why now? Reed said. What changed 14 months ago? Celeste looked up. It was clear from her expression that she had been asking herself this exact question. We completed an acquisition, she said slowly. 14 months ago, we acquired a logistics company in the Southeast. It was a large deal, our biggest single acquisition. It brought in a significant amount of new capital, and more importantly, it brought in new subsidiary account structures that were more complex to monitor than our previous setup. She paused. Graham oversaw the integration of those accounts, so the acquisition gave him the architecture he needed. Yes, she said it quietly. He may have recommended it partly for that reason. And I championed it. I thought it was strategically sound. It was strategically sound. Something moved in her expression. He used my own judgment against me. Reed sat with that. And Sloan? Victor came into our orbit about 2 years ago. He was appointed to lead the Corporate Security Task Force, a state-level initiative, joint public-private, meant to address corporate crime in the region. We were a natural partner. He consulted on our internal security systems, our compliance monitoring infrastructure. She turned the mug slowly in her hands. He would have seen the subsidiary accounts during that process. He would have understood immediately what was possible. So Sloan found the opportunity, and Voss provided the access. That's my read. She looked at him. They needed each other. Graham had the internal access, but not the ability to suppress an investigation from the outside. Victor had the investigative authority, but not the internal mechanism. Together, they could steal and then control every avenue through which the theft could be discovered. She stopped. And when I started looking, when they found out about my audit consultation, they needed it to end. So they tried to kill you. So they tried to kill me. She said it flatly, without dramatics. The flatness was not indifference. It was the sound of someone who has processed something terrible into something functional, which was the only way to keep moving. And when that didn't work, they needed a suspect who would absorb the investigation long enough for them to move the assets. They chose me before the attack, Reed said. The sedan was delivered 3 days before. The camera had to have been installed at least a week earlier, which means they had you selected before they knew the attack would fail. Her eyes were steady on his. You were always part of the plan, Reed, not contingency, primary. He had understood this intellectually since the afternoon before. Hearing it stated plainly, in his own kitchen, in daylight, still produced something cold in his chest. Not fear, exactly. Something adjacent to it. The sensation of understanding that someone has been studying your life from the outside, your routine, your address, your history, and building a story about you that you had no part in writing. They made a mistake, he said. They made several, she agreed. The first was not knowing you well enough. He almost said something to that. He stopped himself. The moment had a quality to it that he didn't want to examine too closely, because he was a mechanic with a dead-grass backyard, and a broken coffee maker and an ongoing criminal accusation, and she was a billionaire with a bullet wound in her side, and whatever the moment contained was not something that had any room to land yet. We need to get you a phone that can't be traced back to your company infrastructure, he said. Birch is arranging it. And we need to get ahead of what Sloan does next. She nodded. He'll push for charges. The evidence he planted is sufficient for an arrest if a cooperative DA signs off. Is there a cooperative DA? Celeste was quiet for a moment. The district attorney's office has received campaign contributions from 2 shell companies in the last election cycle. I found them in the financial records last night. They trace back to the same routing structure as the funds Graham has been moving. Reed looked at her. He looked at her for a long moment. You found all of this in one night, he said. In the hospital, after surgery. I had a lot of coffee. A pause. It was bad coffee. Story of my life, he said. She almost smiled. It was the briefest version of a smile, there and then restructured back into focus. But it was real. He saw it. Then his phone buzzed. It was Marcus. Reed picked up. Reed. Marcus's voice had the tight quality of someone delivering information he doesn't want to be delivering. There's 2 guys outside the shop. They're not in uniform. One of them's been on his phone for the last 10 minutes looking at the shop door. Are they coming in? Not yet. They're just sitting there in a black car. Okay? Reed kept his voice even. Do not approach them. Go about your work. If they come in, you're a mechanic who knows nothing about anything, which is true. Call me if anything changes. He hung up. Celeste was watching him. They're watching the shop, she said. Yes. Which means they're watching for where you go. She paused. Which means they may already be watching this street. Reed stood. He went to the front window and looked out through the gap in the curtains. The street was quiet. Mrs. Delacroix from 3 doors down was walking her dog with the slow authority of someone who treats a daily walk as an act of territorial governance. 2 cars parked along the curb that he didn't recognize, but both had been there when he arrived, and neither showed signs of occupancy. Not yet. We have maybe a day, he said. Maybe less, before they figure out where you are. Then we need to move faster than they expect, Celeste said. She opened her laptop again. I need access to the full subsidiary account records. Not my summary, the raw transfer data. I can get it through our external auditor's back channel if Birch can arrange a secure line. What will that give you? It will give me enough to bring to federal investigators directly, bypassing the district attorney's office, bypassing Sloan's task force, going straight to the Financial Crimes Division. She was already typing. They have no jurisdiction here. Sloan can't touch them. That takes time. Not if I send it tonight. She looked up. I need 3 hours. Reed checked his watch. It was 12:40. He needed to pick up Hallie at 3:50. He needed to do that personally, not because he thought anyone would move against his daughter. They hadn't, and doing so would fundamentally change the nature of what this was. But because Hallie needed to see him at the school door, and he needed to see her face and confirm that she was fine. You have 3 hours, he said. I'll be back by 4:15. He was not back by 4:15. What happened between 12:40 and 7 in the evening was the kind of sequence that, afterward, Reed would have difficulty narrating in a straight line, because it didn't occur in a straight line. It occurred the way bad things often occur, simultaneously, from multiple directions, with each piece arriving before the previous one had finished processing. The first piece arrived at 2:17, when Birch called Celeste to report that the external legal team had obtained preliminary confirmation from a financial crimes contact at the federal level. They were interested, they wanted the data, and they needed it through secure channels before 6 p.m., or they couldn't act until the following week. The second piece arrived at 2:58, when the Blackridge General Hospital security system began malfunctioning. The duty nurse on Celeste's former floor noticed it first. 2 cameras going dark in sequence, then a third, in a pattern that moved from the building's exterior entry points toward the private wing. She reported it to the security desk at 2:59. The security desk called it in as a technical fault at 3:02. By 3:08, when a technician was dispatched, the power to the private wing flickered once and then died entirely. Reed found out about this at 3:11 when Birch called his cell. He was already in the truck driving toward Hallie's school. He pulled over. They're at the hospital, Birch said. Her voice was controlled, but he could hear the effort in it. Security cameras are down in sequence. It's a systematic approach. She's not at the hospital, Reed said. They don't know that yet. A pause. But when they find her room empty, they will begin looking for her. How long do we have before they connect her to my address? They have your address from the investigation. Hours. Maybe less. Birch paused again. Reed, the men watching your shop, Marcus just called me. They left. Both of them. At 3:05. Reed looked at the steering wheel. 3:05. 8 minutes after the hospital cameras started going dark. They were coordinating in real time. I need you to pick up Hallie, he said. Right now. Birch, are you still in the Blackridge area? I'm 4 minutes from the school. Go. Tell her you're a friend of mine. Tell her I'll explain. She's smart. She won't make a scene. Just get her somewhere safe and text me where. He was already pulling back into traffic before Birch confirmed. He drove toward his house, not because he thought Celeste would be safe there now, but because he needed to get her out before the men from the black car arrived, and because 3 hours was almost up, and he needed to know whether she had what she needed to send. He called her as he drove. She picked up on the first ring. I know, she said. You know? Birch called me first. I've been packed for 6 minutes. A pause. The data is ready to transmit. I need 5 more minutes to verify the encryption on the channel. You have less than 5. Then I need 4. Her voice was flat and focused, the way it got when the situation compressed and she stopped having room for anything except the task directly in front of her. Drive. He drove. He came down his residential street at 324, and the black car he didn't recognize was not there yet, but a sedan he had seen twice in the past 2 days, once near the hospital, once outside the shop, was parked 40 meters from his front door with its engine running. He pulled into the driveway, which put the house between his truck and the sedan's sightline. He was inside in 12 seconds. Celeste was standing at the kitchen table, laptop open, one bag on the floor beside her. She looked up when he came through the door. "Sent," she said. He almost said something. 20 seconds ago, she added. Encrypted, verified, sent to the Federal Financial Crimes Division contact through Birch's secure channel. She closed the laptop. They have everything. Reed exhaled once. Then he picked up her bag. "We need to go out the back." They went out the back. The fence between Reed's property and the neighbors. A retired school teacher named Gorman, who grew tomatoes every summer with competitive intensity, had a gate that Reed had put in 3 years ago because Hallie kept climbing over it anyway, and he decided a gate was safer than a fence-climbing 8-year-old. He had never been more grateful for that gate than he was at 3:26 on a Wednesday afternoon. They crossed Gorman's backyard, which at this time of year was all dead tomato stakes and turned soil, and the particular melancholy of a garden in winter, and came out through the side yard onto Prescott Street, which ran parallel to Reed's block and had no line of sight to the sedan. Birch picked them up on Prescott 6 minutes later. Hallie was in the back seat. She looked at her father when he got in, then at Celeste getting in beside him, then back at her father. Her expression was the one she used when she was compiling a significant number of questions she intended to deploy strategically. "Are you in trouble?" she said. "Complicated situation," Reed said. "That's the same as yes." "It's more specific than yes." Hallie looked at Celeste. Celeste looked back at her with the expression of someone who has managed boardrooms and high-stakes negotiations and has no particular framework for an 8-year-old conducting a direct assessment. "Are you the lady from the news?" Hallie said. "Yes," Celeste said. "You got shot." "I did." "Does it hurt?" Celeste considered this with what appeared to be genuine care for the precision of her answer. "Yes, but not as much as yesterday." Hallie nodded, apparently satisfied with this as a response. She turned back to the window. Reed looked at Birch in the rearview mirror. Birch was driving with the focused attention of someone running through contingency options, which was probably accurate. "Where are we going?" he said. "I have a property," Birch said. "Outside Blackridge, about 40 minutes. It's not connected to any of our names." "Whose name is it in?" "My mother's," Birch said. "She passed 4 years ago, and the estate transfer is still technically in process because I haven't had the time to resolve it. Nobody is looking at it." "Is it livable?" "It has heat and running water, and I stocked it this morning," she said, with the precision of someone who has been staying 3 steps ahead of a disaster since approximately midnight. "It will do." They drove. The afternoon was gray and getting grayer, the sky doing the thing it does in Massachusetts in the late fall, when it can't decide between overcast and rain and settles on both, and the highway unrolled ahead of them through bare-branched trees and occasional fields. Hallie fell asleep against the door, which was the particular talent of children who trust unconditionally that the adults around them are handling whatever needs handling. Reed looked out the passenger window and thought about the encrypted data sitting in a federal investigator's secure system. He thought about how long it would take to verify and act. He thought about the difference between material that could build a case and material that could protect them tonight, which were not the same thing and did not operate on the same timeline. He thought about Victor Sloan standing in that interrogation room with a photograph of surveillance equipment, building a case with clean hands and a clean suit and 14 months of careful preparation. And then he thought about the hospital. He thought about the cameras going dark in sequence, the systematic approach, the way the power had been cut to the private wing. He had seen that specific sequence before, not in Blackridge, not in civilian life, but in a different context where the person approaching from the outside wanted to control what was visible to the people inside. It was not an opportunistic move, it was a practiced one, which meant the people Victor Sloan used for this kind of work were not ordinary contractors. They were people who had done this before, systematically.
in sequence, with the precise discipline of someone who had been trained for exactly this. "How many people does Sloan have working directly for him?" Reed asked. Celeste had been quiet for most of the drive, watching the road with the expression of someone cataloging things. She turned at the question. "His task force has 12 official members, but the men who conducted the attack on Tuesday, they weren't city personnel. I've been thinking about that." "Private contractors?" "Yes, but not ordinary private security. The coordination was too clean." She paused. Victor spent 8 years in federal law enforcement before moving into the corporate task force role. He would have contacts, people who left with skills and without constraints. Reed nodded. He had already been thinking this. "The man at the hospital today," he said. "The ones running the camera sequence. That's not improvised. That's a team that does this as a practice." "Which means they won't stop," Celeste said. "No," Reed said. "They won't stop." The car was quiet for a moment. "How long before the federal team can move?" he asked Birch. "The contact I have told me 24 to 48 hours to verify the data and establish grounds for action." She kept her eyes on the road. "They need to authenticate the documents, trace the routing independently, confirm that what we sent matches their own investigative picture." "Do they have an existing picture?" "Our contact suggested there may be an existing inquiry." Birch chose her words with care. "Not specifically targeting Graham Voss, but targeting the kind of financial structure we identified, the shell companies, the routing architecture." She paused. "It's possible our data connects to something they've already been building." Reed processed that. If there was an existing federal inquiry, the data Celeste had sent didn't just open a new case. It potentially completed something that was already in motion. That changed the timeline. That changed what 48 hours meant. It also changed what Sloan would do if he found out. Because a man who spent 8 years in federal law enforcement would know exactly what an existing inquiry looked like and what it meant for his exposure. And a man who knew that would not wait 48 hours. He would move tonight. Reed looked at the back of Hallie's head, resting against the car door. Her hair escaped from its morning ponytail in the specific entropy of a child who has been through a long and confusing day and still managed to fall asleep in the back of a stranger's car because her father was next to her, and that was enough. He needed to keep it enough. He looked back at the road and started thinking about what tonight would look like, and what the 40 meters of driveway at Birch's mother's property looked like, and what exits existed, and what a team of trained contractors would choose as their approach vector if they located the address. He had not wanted to do this kind of thinking in years. He had not stopped being capable of it. That was the thing about certain kinds of training. You didn't get to retire from it completely. You could put it in a room and close the door. You could go 6 months without opening the door. But the room was always there, and when you needed it, it opened the way it always had, fully stocked, nothing missing. He was in that room now. He was going to need everything in it. Birch's mother's property appeared ahead through the bare trees. A low white farmhouse set back from the road behind a gravel driveway, lights on inside, no other vehicles visible. The nearest neighbor was a quarter-mile in either direction. The tree line behind the house was dense enough to provide cover, which was both an advantage and a problem, depending on which side of it you were on. Reed scanned it as they pulled in. Driveway approach, sight lines from the road, the tree line, the position of the exterior lights, and where their coverage ended. He made a mental map. He was going to need it. Inside, the farmhouse was exactly what Birch had promised. Functional, unadorned, heated, the kind of space that had been lived in thoroughly and recently emptied, the impression of someone's life still present in the walls, but the person gone. There were photographs on the mantel that Birch quietly turned face down when she came in, which Reed noticed and did not comment on. Hallie woke up when the car stopped and walked into the farmhouse with the unquestioning adaptability of a child who had learned that sometimes you just go where your father goes and ask questions later. She found the couch, dropped her backpack, and pulled out a battered library book she had apparently been carrying all day. Celeste stood in the kitchen, looking at nothing in particular, one hand resting light on the counter near her injured side. She had been moving carefully all afternoon, not complaining, not asking for accommodation, just quietly managing a body that was doing the difficult work of beginning to repair itself, while the person inside it refused to slow down. Reed watched her for a moment from the doorway. "You should eat something," he said.
I'm not asking. She looked. There was something in her expression that was not quite irritation and not quite amusement, and existed in the specific territory between them that people occupy when they have been through something significant together and are still figuring out what that means. There's food in the cooler, Birch said from behind Reed. I stocked it this morning. Practical things. Nothing that requires cooking. Perfect, Celeste said. She opened the cooler. She sat at the kitchen table. She ate, which Reed took as a small victory in a day that had been short on them. He sat across from her. He ate too, because his body had been running on something other than food since the previous morning, and that was a deficit that would eventually collect. For a few minutes, the kitchen was quiet, except for the sound of the farmhouse settling in the cold and Hallie in the next room turning pages. They're going to find this place, Celeste said. Not as a fear, as a fact that needed to be on the table. Probably, Reed said. Not tonight. Maybe tomorrow. So tonight we're safe. Tonight we're safer than we were. She considered this. That's an honest answer. I try. Celeste looked at the table surface for a moment. Then, I've been thinking about Victor, about what he does next. Me too, Reed said. He's going to realize the hospital was empty. He's going to know I'm somewhere. And he's going to know that if I've had time to transmit anything, his exposure has changed. Yes. A man in his position, facing that level of exposure. She stopped. She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. He moves the assets and disappears, Reed said, or he eliminates the problem first. He'll try to do both. She looked up. We can't wait 48 hours for the federal team to verify and act. We need to give them a reason to move faster. What kind of reason? Celeste was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, her voice had the particular quality it got when she was thinking several steps ahead and beginning to work backward from a conclusion. Victor is going to try to move the financial records tonight. He has a location, somewhere outside the company's systems, somewhere he thinks is controlled. If he gets those records out of reach before the federal team can subpoena them, we lose the evidentiary trail. You know where he had moved them? I know the kind of place he'd use. She opened her laptop. The shell companies that received the routed funds. 3 of them have physical addresses. 2 are clearly false registration addresses, post boxes and the like. But one has a warehouse location, registered to a logistics company in the Blackridge Harbor area. She turned the laptop so he could see the screen. It came up 3 times in the transfer records as a physical delivery point for hardware, servers specifically, high-capacity storage servers. Reed looked at the address on the screen. Blackridge Harbor, South Dock District. A warehouse in a location that was technically accessible from both land and water, that had limited foot traffic after dark. That was in a part of the city where late-night vehicle movement didn't attract attention. It was exactly where he would have put it. If Sloan is moving tonight, Reed said slowly, he'll want to be finished before the federal team's business day starts tomorrow. Which means he moves in the next 6 hours, Celeste said. They looked at each other across the kitchen table of a dead woman's farmhouse, with Hallie's page turning audible from the next room and the cold pressing in from outside, and the weight of the next 6 hours sitting between them like something physical. I need to make a call, Reed said. He had not used this number in 4 years. He picked up the phone anyway. The number rang 4 times before it picked up. Well, said the voice on the other end. I was starting to think you were dead. The voice belonged to a man named Danny Reyes, 41 years old, formerly Petty Officer First Class. Daniel Reyes of SEAL Team 8, currently running what he described as a private security consulting firm out of Providence, Rhode Island, which was a technically accurate description of something that covered considerably more ground than the title suggested. Reed had served with Danny for 6 years. He was the kind of person who made bad situations worse for the people causing them and significantly better for everyone else, and he had a gift for appearing where he was needed with very little notice. Not dead, Reed said. Close proximity to it. I saw the news. A pause, and in it the particular quality of attention that Danny gave things when he was shifting from casual to operational. The mechanic who saved the CEO. I thought, that's a very Reed Callahan kind of thing to do. And then they started saying maybe the mechanic wasn't saving her at all. Someone built a frame around me. 3 days in advance. Danny made that sound. Not quite a word, not quite a grunt, but a vocalization that meant he was processing and had already moved past surprise into logistics. "What do you need?" Reed told him. He told him about the warehouse on Black Ridge Harbor, the storage servers, the 6-hour window, and what he suspected Sloan would do and when. He told him about the federal inquiry and the transmitted data and the 48-hour verification timeline that was too long given what they were facing tonight. Danny listened without interrupting, which was one of his better qualities. When Reed finished, Danny said, "I can be there by 9. You don't have to come yourself." "I know I don't have to." His voice had the mildly affronted quality of someone who has been told something they consider self-evident. "When have I ever done things I had to do? I'll bring Costa. She's been useful lately." "Who is Costa?" "Former Army intelligence. She reads financial documentation like it's a novel she can't put down. If there are servers in that warehouse, she'll know what's on them before whoever put them there can wipe them." A brief pause. "Also, she's impossible to rattle, which I find useful in situations like yours." "Danny," Reed looked at the kitchen wall. "I have my daughter here." "I know," Danny said. His voice had shifted slightly. Not softer exactly, but more considered. "I know you do. That's why I'm coming myself." Reed didn't respond to that immediately. There wasn't much to say to it that would have been adequate. 9 o'clock, he said instead. 9 o'clock, Danny confirmed. "Don't do anything before I get there." "I won't." "Reed." "I won't, Danny." He hung up. He stood in the kitchen for a moment. Celeste was watching him from the table with the expression she had when she was waiting for information and had the patience to wait correctly. "Someone I served with," he said. "He'll be here by 9. He's bringing someone who can deal with what's on those servers." "And the warehouse itself?" "We'll figure that out when we know what Sloan does between now and then." Celeste nodded. She started to close her laptop, then stopped. Her hand rested on the lid without pressing it down. "Reed," she said, "what happens if we're wrong about the warehouse? If he's already moved everything, or if he chose a different location?" It was a fair question, and she was asking it the way she asked things, directly, without pretending she wasn't worried about the answer. "Then we still have what you sent to the federal team," he said. "It's less than we need it to be, but it's not nothing. It might not be enough to move fast enough." "No," he said. "It might not." She closed the laptop. She looked at the window, which showed nothing except their own reflections in the dark glass and the shape of the tree line beyond. "I've spent a long time building something that I thought was solid," she said. "A company, a team, a structure, and all of it, the whole architecture, had someone inside it for over a year who was pulling it apart thread by thread, and I didn't see it." "You saw it," Reed said. "That's why you scheduled the audit. Too late." "You saw it in time to be worth killing," he said, "which is the same thing as seeing it in time, depending on what comes next." She turned from the window and looked at him with the expression she made when she was deciding whether to say something. After a moment, she said, "You're a strange person to be having this conversation with in a dead woman's farmhouse at 8 o'clock at night." "You're a strange person to be having it with in general," he said. She did smile then, briefly, genuinely, with the quality of something that had arrived without her deciding to produce it, which was the only kind of smile Reed had ever found worth much. Then they both heard Hallie from the next room. "I'm hungry again." "You ate an hour ago," Reed called back. "It wore off." He looked at Celeste. Celeste looked at him. "There's more in the cooler," she said. Reed went and fed his daughter. Danny arrived at 8:57, which was 3 minutes early, which was characteristic. He came in a gray pickup truck that had seen better decades, accompanied by a woman Reed had not met before, who went by Costa and who was compact, dark-haired, and gave the immediate impression of someone who had made a considered decision at some point in her life to never appear surprised by anything. She shook Reed's hand at the door. Her grip was brief and firm. She looked at him with the kind of direct assessment that comes from having spent years in environments where reading people quickly is a professional requirement. Then she looked past him into the house, took in Hallie on the couch with her library book, Celeste at the kitchen table with the laptop, Birch near the window with her phone. "Okay," Costa said. "Where's the financial data?" Danny embraced Reed the way men who have been in significant danger together embrace. Briefly, without ceremony, the way you'd greet someone you'd been genuinely worried about without wanting to make a production of the worry. He was still built the same way he'd always been. broad through the shoulders, with an energy that suggested he was running faster internally than the situation externally required. He scanned the room in the same instinctive sequence Reed had used outside. "Nice house," he said. "It's not mine." "I know. That's why it's nice." He moved toward the kitchen. "Tell me everything you didn't tell me on the phone," Reed told him. He told him about Victor Sloan's precision, the way the case had been built around Reed with a patience that implied weeks of preparation, the surveillance equipment, the planted documents, the coordinated attack with professional contractors. He told him about the hospital cameras going dark in sequence. He told him about the federal inquiry that Birch's contact had referenced and what it might mean. Danny sat at the kitchen table across from Celeste, who had introduced herself with the neutrality of someone who understood this wasn't a moment for her title or her net worth, and listened to all of it with his hands folded on the table. When Reed finished, Danny looked at Celeste. "The warehouse," he said. "You identified it from the transfer records." "One physical delivery address appeared 3 times, she said. "Storage servers sent to a logistics shell company at a warehouse on the South Dock. It's the only address in the records that corresponds to physical infrastructure rather than financial routing." "If I'm Victor Sloan and I need to move server hardware tonight," Danny said, "what time do I move it?" "After 11, Celeste said without hesitation. "Dock activity drops off between 11 and 2. Not 0. There's always some movement, but reduced enough that vehicles can move without creating a notable pattern. So between 11 and 2. "My estimate." Danny nodded. He looked at Cost, who had set up at the kitchen table's far end with a laptop and a set of portable drives, and was doing several things at once, with the specific efficiency of someone who treats computational work as a form of manual labor requiring equal concentration. "Costa," Danny said. "Warehouse server retrieval. What do we need?" "I need to be inside before they start a wipe," she said, not looking up. "They've already initiated a remote wipe. I need to be on the hardware within the first 4 minutes. After that, the recoverable window narrows fast." She paused. "I also need to know what I'm walking into." "Network architecture, server model if possible, whether they're running local or hybrid cloud storage." "We don't have that," Reed said. "I know you don't. I'll adapt." She said it as a factual statement, the same way you'd say the sky is overcast. Reed looked at Danny. "Sloan will have people at the warehouse, the contractors, the same team that ran the hospital approach." "How many?" "Hospital approach looked like 3, possibly 4. Reed thought about the camera sequence, the power cut, the way the evacuation toward the wrong stairwell had been handled. They move in a specific pattern, control the exterior points first, then the interior. They're disciplined. Danny considered this. "We don't have the numbers to go against a 4-person contractor team at a warehouse and come out clean." "No," Reed agreed. "We don't go against them." "Then how?" "We don't need them to leave," Reed said. "We need them to not know we're there." He looked at the window, at the black rectangle of the tree line outside. "I need a floor plan." Birch looked up from her phone. "I can get a property record. It'll take 20 minutes. "Get it?" Birch got it. She got it in 14 minutes, a warehouse layout from the county property registry, accessed through a database her firm maintained. She printed it at the farmhouse printer, which produced it slowly and slightly crooked, and Reed spread it on the kitchen table. The warehouse was long and narrow, oriented parallel to the dock, with 2 vehicle access points on the land side and 1 personnel door on the water side. Interior, 1 large open bay, a partitioned office section in the northwest corner, a secondary storage area accessed through a connecting door. Ceiling height sufficient for racking. No basement. Reed studied it. He traced the exterior with his finger. "This wall faces the water," he said. "If there's activity on the dockside tonight, it's visible from the bay, but not from the vehicle entrance." "Meaning?" Danny said. "Meaning Sloan's people will be watching the land approach. The dockside is less monitored." He tapped the personnel door. "Single point of entry from the water. If it's locked from inside, it's a problem. If it's locked from outside, it's manageable." "And we find out which by going there," Danny said. "We find out which by going there." Danny sat back. He looked at Reed with the expression he had always made before something difficult. Not reluctance, more like a man reviewing a calculation one final time before committing to the answer. "You know what I'm going to say. You're going to say I should stay here." You have a daughter sleeping in the next room. I know. Reed. Danny's voice was not unkind. It was the voice of someone who had watched Reed function under extreme pressure and had also watched what happened afterward. I can do this. Costa can do this. You staying here and keeping those two safe is not a lesser task. Reed looked at the floor plan. He thought about the argument he could make, his knowledge of Victor Sloan's methods, his read of the contractor team's tactical pattern, the specific value of having someone at the warehouse who understood what the servers represented and how to sequence the extraction from an evidentiary standpoint. He thought about all of that. And then he thought about Hallie asking from the next room whether he'd been scared on Decker Street, and answering that yeah, a little, after, and that being the only honest answer he'd had all day. There's one thing I need to be there for, he said. The approach assessment. I know what that team's pattern looks like now. If you go in without someone who's seen them move, you're guessing. Danny looked at him. I come for the approach assessment, Reed said. I read the exterior. I give you the entry recommendation, and then I come back here. And if it goes sideways before you leave? Then it goes sideways, and I deal with that when it happens, same as always. Danny pressed his lips together. He knew when he'd lost an argument with Reed Callahan, because it had happened enough times over enough years that he had developed a reasonable ability to identify the moment. He turned to Birch. Can you stay with the daughter? Birch looked at Reed, then at Hallie's library book lying open and face down on the couch armrest where she'd left it when she fell asleep. Yes, she said. I'm staying too, Celeste said. 3 people looked at her. Don't, she said, before any of them could produce the sentence they were building. I understand why you're going to tell me not to come. I understand that I had surgery 48 hours ago and that I'm in no condition to be useful at a waterfront warehouse at midnight. I'm staying. I'm not arguing about it. I'm just, she paused, telling you that I know what's at stake in that building, and I need you to know that I know. Nobody said anything for a moment. Okay, Reed said finally. She nodded once. What? They left at 10:30. Reed, Danny, and Costa in Danny's truck, moving through Black Ridge on secondary roads that ran parallel to the main routes. The city was quiet in the way that cities get on cold Wednesday nights. Not empty, but reduced. The bars and restaurants putting out their last customers, the streets thinning to delivery vehicles, and the occasional late commuter. The harbor district came up slowly, the smell of it first, salt and diesel and something industrial that had no precise name, then the lights of the dock area through the windshield, scattered and yellow, the dark water visible between buildings. Danny pulled the truck into a lot 200 meters from the warehouse and killed the lights. They sat and looked. The warehouse was lit on the land side. 2 exterior floods illuminating the vehicle entrances with the kind of flat, harsh light that is meant to suggest surveillance. On the dock side, visible from their angle as a dark shape against the water, there was no exterior lighting at all. One vehicle was parked near the south vehicle entrance. Dark sedan. Reed recognized the model. It had been described by Marcus when the men were watching the shop. Not definitive, but consistent. One vehicle visible, Danny said quietly. Could be 2 people, could be 4. Could be more inside, Costa said from the back seat. Yes, Reed said. He was watching the building. He was watching the way the light fell and where it didn't fall, and the gap between the warehouse's south wall and the dock railing, and the personnel door that sat in the shadow between 2 overhead floods that had been positioned, he now noticed, to leave exactly that section dark. He had been wrong about the dockside lighting. There was no exterior light on the personnel door, not because it was less monitored. It was because whoever had set this up knew that a gap in the lighting pattern was itself a useful thing. It gave approaching personnel a natural shadow path that felt like an invitation. It's a funnel, Reed said. Danny turned. What? The personnel door. The lights are positioned to leave it dark. Anyone approaching from the dockside is going to move toward that shadow instinctively because shadow means cover. He watched the building. Which means there's someone inside watching that door. Costa leaned forward from the back seat. So we don't use the personnel door? No. Reed studied the roofline. The secondary storage area in the northwest corner, the connecting door and the floor plan. What's on the exterior wall of that section? Standard panel wall, Danny said, looking at the floor plan on his phone. No windows, no secondary access point shown. No shown, Reed said. But look at the property record date. The building was constructed in 1987. The secondary storage partition was added in 2003. It's a renovation addition. You can see it in the property history. Renovated sections in that era of commercial construction almost always included an emergency egress point for code compliance. Danny was quiet for a moment, looking at the document. Then, there's a code compliance note in the 2003 permit filing, secondary egress to the north elevation. North elevation puts it behind the building, away from the dock and away from the vehicle entrance. It's not in the main floor plan because it was added after the original filing. Danny looked at Reed. You got all that from a county property record. I've spent 6 years reading building permits for shop expansion purposes, Reed said. You get a feel for the paperwork. Danny made a sound that was either a laugh or an exhale. It was close enough to both that the distinction didn't matter. They repositioned the truck. The north elevation was accessible from a maintenance road that ran behind the dockside warehouses, narrow and unpaved, the kind of road that existed for utility access and was therefore unlikely to be watched. Danny drove it slowly, without headlights, using the ambient dock lighting as enough to navigate by. The north wall of the warehouse came into view, and there, 6 feet from the corner, was a gray metal door with a push-bar handle and a faded code compliance sticker. Not locked from outside. Push bar from inside only, which meant you could push out but not pull in. Reed looked at it. He looked at the door, the wall, the shadow the building cast over this side, and the dock light. This is where I leave you, he said. Danny looked at him. I gave you the entry point, Reed said. That's what I said I was here for. Reed, Hallie. The word was simple. It was the entirety of the argument. Danny held his gaze for a moment, then he nodded. Reed looked at Costa. The servers, you're looking for transaction logs and communication records. If there's a folder structure, the communications will be in a separate partition from the financial data. Don't merge the copies, keep them separate for chain of evidence. I know, Costa said, not unkindly. I know you know. He paused. Thank you. He got out of the truck. He walked back down the maintenance road to where the road met the dockside street, and he called Birch for a pickup. And while he waited, he stood in the cold and watched the dark water of Blackridge Harbor moving with the particular slow patience of water that has been here long before any of this and will be here long after. His shoulder ached. The deep bruise from the attacker's elbow had settled in with an intent to stay, and the field dressing was still wrapped and still doing its job. But the cold brought the discomfort up in a way that the afternoon's activity had partially suppressed. He stood with it. He had learned that you could stand with pain if you thought of it as information rather than complaint. His shoulder was telling him he had used it in ways it hadn't been used in 4 years. He was aware. He filed it. Birch arrived in 12 minutes. He got in. Danny's inside, she said. Working on it. She drove. Reed watched the harbor lights through the passenger window. How long? She asked. An hour. Maybe less. He thought about Costa and her 4-minute window and her absolute certainty that she would adapt. Probably less. At the farmhouse, Celeste was awake. This was not a surprise to anyone, but Birch gave her a look when they came in that communicated both understanding and mild resignation. And Celeste acknowledged it with the expression of someone who knows they are behaving exactly as expected and has decided to continue anyway. She was sitting at the kitchen table with her laptop and a legal pad covered in handwriting that had grown progressively smaller as the page filled, the writing of someone packing as much into the available space as possible. She looked up when Reed came in and read his face the way she had been reading his face since the hotel alcove, with a speed and accuracy that still occasionally surprised him. "They're in," she said. Not a question. "Working on it." "Sit down." "I'm fine." "Reed." Her voice was not unkind. "Sit down." He sat down. He put his elbows on the table and he sat in the particular way of someone whose body has been running on a combination of necessity and muscle memory and has now stopped moving and is beginning to register everything it was ignoring. Celeste slid a glass of water toward him. He drank it. "What did you find?" he asked, nodding at the legal pad. "I've been building a communication record," she said. "Not financial, personal. Emails between Graham and Victor, routed through an external server that I found referenced in the subsidiary account records as an administrative contact point. They used it for what they thought was private communication about the accounts. She paused. They discussed the audit in one exchange. They discussed the attack. They discussed you. Reed looked at the pad. The handwriting was dense and precise. They discussed me by name? By description initially. Former military, repair shop on Decker, daily routine accessible for observation. Then by name, 3 days before the attack. She looked at him steadily. Graham wrote, and I'm paraphrasing, but not by much, that the mechanic was ideal because his military background would make the tactical precision of the rescue look like participation rather than intervention. Reed absorbed this. They knew exactly what they were building, he said. Yes. She looked at the pad. Graham was more uncomfortable with the attack itself than Victor was. There are 2 exchanges where he asks whether it's necessary to go that far, whether there's another way to suppress the audit before I can bring it to the board. Her voice didn't change in character, but something in its depth shifted. Victor told him it was the only method with a guaranteed window. He said, she looked at the pad, that everything else left variables. The kitchen was quiet. Birch, Reed said. Birch had been standing near the door. I'll add it to what we sent to the federal team, she said. This is the communication record that links the financial data to intent. This is what turns a financial crime case into a conspiracy charge. She looked at Celeste. This is significant. Send it tonight, Celeste said. Everything, the communication records, the routing documents, all of it. I will. Birch moved toward the other room where her equipment was set up. She stopped. Celeste, if this reaches the federal team tonight, alongside what we already sent, they don't wait 48 hours. This is the kind of evidence that shortens timelines considerably. Celeste nodded. She looked at the kitchen table surface for a moment. Reed's phone buzzed. Danny. We're in. Servers are intact. Costa is working. You were right about the door. Also right about the funnel. One person inside watching the personnel entry. He's currently unaware. We're good. Reed exhaled. He set the phone on the table face up so Celeste could read it. She read it. Something in her face, the particular held quality it had carried for the last day and a half. The compression of someone managing a very large amount of something very difficult in a very small space, shifted, not released. Shifted, like a pressure that has been absolute finding its first small variation. Okay, she said quietly. Just that. Yeah, Reed said. They sat in the kitchen while Birch worked in the other room and Hallie slept on the couch, and the harbor water moved somewhere in the dark beyond the tree line, and the clock on the wall moved past midnight, and they waited. Danny texted again at 12:41. Costa had copied everything: financial records, communication logs, administrative files, server architecture documentation. She had also found something additional: a secondary file partition containing what appeared to be records from other operations, other targets, other companies where the same financial structure had been used. Marlowe Global was not the first. It was the most recent. Reed read this to Celeste. She sat with it. How many? He typed the question to Danny. Danny's reply came back in 2 minutes. Costa's preliminary read: 4 other companies over 7 years. The same routing architecture, the same shell company structure, the same pattern of gradually escalating theft before either extraction or, in 2 cases, something else. Reed didn't read that last part aloud. He would tell her when there was time to sit with it properly. What he read aloud was, Federal team is going to have more than enough. Celeste looked at the window. The tree line was just visible in the faint pre-dawn gray that was beginning at the horizon's edge. Not light yet, but the absence of absolute dark, which was a different thing and sometimes had to be enough. Victor is going to know by morning, she said. Yes. When he finds the warehouse, he'll find it already surrounded, Reed said. Danny called the federal contact directly from inside. They're moving tonight, now. He looked at his phone. Sloan gets there and finds federal investigators instead of servers. Celeste turned from the window. She looked at him with an expression he hadn't quite seen from her before. Not the assessment expression, not the operational focus, not the controlled management of a difficult situation. Something underneath all of those. Something that was present when everything else had momentarily finished demanding to be the primary thing. It's over, she said. The 2 words carried an entire weight. Not celebration,
Not relief exactly, more like the sound of someone who has been holding something for a very long time and has just been told they can set it down but isn't quite ready to believe it yet. The worst of it, Reed said. The rest takes time. She nodded. She looked at the legal pad. She looked at her hands. I don't know how to... She started.
You don't have to, Reed said. She looked up. Not tonight, he said. Tonight you just let it be done. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked away, toward the window, toward the gray that was happening at the edge of the sky. At 2:17 in the morning, Birch came into the kitchen with her phone in her hand and an expression that was the closest thing to unguarded Reed had seen from her. The federal team confirmed receipt of the second transmission, she said. They've authorized an immediate field response. They're citing the communication records as the basis for expedited action. She stopped. Victor Sloan is being taken into custody tonight. Graham Voss will be served at his residence at 6 a.m. The kitchen was very quiet. Hallie made a small sound from the other room. The sound of someone shifting in sleep, adjusting, settling back down. Reed looked at the table. He looked at the routing documents and the legal pad and the half-empty water glass and the burned coffee residue on the mug from earlier. He breathed. And somewhere at Blackridge Harbor, in a warehouse that had been built in 1987 and renovated in 2003 and used for 14 months as a repository for stolen evidence, federal investigators were walking through a door while Danny Reyes held it open and Costa finished backing up the last partition to a portable drive she would hand over with the particular satisfaction of someone who has solved a problem that was, in her estimation, genuinely interesting. Victor Sloan was taken into custody at 2:43 in the morning at a marina 12 miles south of Blackridge, where federal agents found him boarding a private vessel with 2 hard cases of documents and a one-way ticket to a connecting flight in Montreal filed under a name that was not his own. He did not resist. That was the detail that surprised people later. That a man who had orchestrated a coordinated assassination attempt, who had run a financial conspiracy across 7 years and 5 companies, who had built frames around innocent people with the patience of someone who had done it before and expected to do it again, simply sat down on the dock when the agents identified themselves and said nothing at all. Reed learned about the arrest from Danny at 3:15 a.m. via text. He read it twice. He set the phone on the kitchen table in the farmhouse and sat with the information for a moment, the way you sit with something you have been working toward for 2 days, and which, now that it has arrived, feels different than you expected. Not smaller, but more complicated, more weighted, more attached to everything that came before it. Graham Voss was arrested at his home at 6:04 a.m., as promised. According to Birch's federal contact, he opened the door in a bathrobe and appeared to understand immediately what was happening. He asked twice whether his lawyer could be present before he said anything. Then he said, "How much do they have?" When the agent told him, he sat down on his front step in the cold in his bathrobe and did not say anything else for a long time. The arrests were not public until 9 a.m. when a federal spokesperson released a brief statement confirming that 2 individuals had been taken into custody in connection with an ongoing financial crimes investigation, and that the investigation encompassed multiple companies and a 7-year period of activity. The statement mentioned Marlowe Global by name. It did not mention Reed Callahan. That omission, small as it was, mattered enormously to Reed in a way he couldn't have fully explained. His name had been attached to something terrible for 3 days. Having it simply not appear, not cleared, not exonerated, just absent from a statement about people who had actually done the thing, felt like the first breath of air in a room that had been sealed. At 9:20, the Blackridge DA's office issued a separate statement confirming that all investigative action against Reed Callahan had been suspended pending a full review of evidence integrity. By 10 a.m., Detective Commander Victor Sloan had been formally suspended from his role with the Corporate Security Task Force. By noon, 3 of the contractors involved in the Decker Street attack had been identified and 2 were in custody, the third having apparently made a travel decision in the night that federal agents were now tracking across 2 state lines. Hallie found out about most of this from the television in the farmhouse living room, where she had relocated herself and her library book at approximately 7 a.m. with the self-sufficiency of a child who has decided not to wait for adults to organize breakfast, and has therefore organized it herself, which in this case meant a sleeve of crackers from the cooler and a glass of water she'd poured carefully and spilled only slightly. When the news segment mentioned her father's name, specifically, a local reporter standing outside Callahan Auto saying that Reed Callahan, initially a person of interest in Tuesday's attack, appeared to be fully exonerated by the federal arrests. Hallie looked at the television and then looked at her father, who was sitting at the kitchen table behind her visible through the open doorway, and said, "They said your name." "I heard. They said you didn't do it. I know. They should have known that first," she said. She said it without drama. Not angry, just factual, the way children state obvious things that adults have complicated. Then she went back to her crackers and her book. Reed looked at the table. He looked at the mug in his hand. He didn't say anything, because there wasn't anything to add to what his 8-year-old had just said with complete accuracy. Celeste, who had been in the doorway between the kitchen and the hall, had heard it too. She didn't say anything either, but she looked at Hallie's back, the small straight line of it, the cracker held in one hand and the book in the other, with an expression that Reed saw and that had no name he could immediately assign to it. They stayed at the farmhouse through the day. Birch advised it. There were still procedural pieces in motion, the third contractor was still unaccounted for, and appearing publicly while federal investigators were still consolidating their case was the kind of thing that generated questions nobody needed to answer right now. So they stayed. And the day passed with the particular quality of days that follow extreme events, where the absence of immediate crisis creates a kind of disoriented stillness, and people move through ordinary actions, making food, drinking coffee, reading, napping, with the slightly dreamlike quality of individuals who are still catching up to the fact that the emergency is over. Danny and Costa left at mid-morning. Costa packed her drives with the care of someone handling archival material, which it was, and shook Reed's hand at the door the same way she'd shaken it the night before. Brief, firm, no ceremony. "You were right about the egress door," she said. "Lucky guess," Reed said. "No, it wasn't," she said, and left. Danny lingered on the porch for a moment after Costa had gotten into the truck. He looked at Reed in the way he looked at Reed when he was going to say something he'd been holding for a while. "She seems good," Danny said, meaning Hallie, meaning the general assessment of how things were. "She's good," Reed said. "You seem less terrible than I expected." "Thanks. I mean, considering someone framed you for an assassination attempt 3 days ago, and you've had approximately 6 hours of sleep since then." Danny studied him. "You know what I think? Probably not relevant. I think you've been waiting for something to do." He said it simply, without accusation. Not the SEAL stuff. Just something that matters outside the shop, outside the routine. He paused. "You're a good father, Reed. I've watched you do it for 4 years, but you've been running on maintenance mode." Reed looked at the tree line. The morning was cold and clear in the way fall mornings get after a night of low cloud, everything slightly sharper than expected, the bare branches distinct against a sky that was actually blue for the first time in several days. "I know," he said. "Okay," Danny said. That was all. No advice, no follow-up. He had made his observation, and he was done with it, which was one of the things Reed had always respected about him. They shook hands. Danny got in the truck. He drove down the gravel driveway and turned onto the road and was gone. Reed stood on the porch for another minute. He could hear Hallie inside arguing good-naturedly with the television about something the news anchor had said, which was a thing she did, and which he found consistently inexplicable and entirely her own. He went back inside. The formal legal process took months. That was the nature of it. The arrest was the dramatic moment, the visible thing, the part that made the news cycle. What came after was slower and far less cinematic. Depositions, evidence chains, grand jury proceedings, the long procedural architecture of building a case that would stand up through every challenge a team of very expensive defense attorneys could mount. Graham Voss, facing 7 years of documented financial conspiracy across 5 companies and a charge of ordering a murder attempt that had resulted in actual bodily harm, negotiated. His attorneys negotiated extensively and skillfully and ultimately arrived at a plea arrangement that required him to provide complete testimony against Victor Sloan in exchange for a sentence reduction that was still, by any reasonable measure, a very long time. Victor Sloan did not negotiate. He maintained, through his attorney, that the evidence was circumstantial, that the communications had been mischaracterized, that the financial records had been mishandled in their extraction, and that Reed Callahan remained a person whose presence at multiple key moments in this sequence deserved deeper scrutiny. His attorney said this in motions, in statements, in a brief media appearance outside the federal courthouse that generated a news cycle for approximately 2 days before the weight of the evidence made it collapse under its own implausibility. Victor Sloan was convicted on 18 counts. He was sentenced to 22 years. The third contractor was apprehended in upstate New York, 11 days after the arrests, at a roadside motel where he had been using cash and a phone he'd purchased at a gas station. He was 29 years old. In his possession were 2 phones, a laptop, $4,000 in cash, and a photograph of his daughter, who was 3 years old and lived with her mother in Baltimore. At his hearing, he was the only one of the 4 arrested contractors who looked at the people across the room from him in a way that suggested he understood what he had been part of. Reed was not present at any of the hearings or the trial. He was called twice as a witness, gave his testimony plainly and without elaboration, and each time drove back to Blackridge and opened the shop the following morning because the cars were still waiting and Marcus was still there, and the rhythm of it, the specific, ordinary, grease and metal rhythm of it, was the thing that kept him oriented when everything else felt like it was running slightly faster than his ability to process it. Celeste testified on 4 occasions. She was, by all accounts, an exceptional witness, precise, unflappable, with a command of the financial detail that reduced the defense team's cross-examinations to exercises in diminishing returns. Her attorneys had warned her it would be difficult. She had listened to their warnings with the expression she made when people underestimated what she was capable of managing, which was an expression Reed had come to recognize. She had also, in the months between the arrests and the trial, done several other things. She had ordered a comprehensive security audit of Marlowe Global's infrastructure, every system, every access point, every consultant who had touched their monitoring architecture. She had brought in an outside firm with no existing relationship to the company, no connection to Blackridge, and instructions to find everything that should not be there. They found several things, none as significant as what Graham and Victor had built, but enough to indicate that the company's security culture had been, for over a decade, built on a foundation of trust that had not been adequately verified. She had also called each of the 5 companies that the warehouse server records identified as prior targets of the same financial structure. 2 were still operating. 3 had failed, not, as their postmortems had concluded, due to market conditions or strategic errors, but due to the specific, carefully managed extraction of capital that had left them structurally compromised while appearing externally healthy. The people who had run those companies, the people who had been called failures or poor managers or victims of their own bad judgment, had their reputations adjusted accordingly. She had not done any of this quietly or without effort. She had done it while healing from a bullet wound, while navigating federal proceedings, while managing a company whose board was processing the revelation that their CFO had been stealing from them for over a year. She had done it on insufficient sleep and with a physical recovery that moved at its own pace regardless of her schedule. And there were days when she sat in her office and felt the full weight of everything, not just what had happened to her, but what had happened to 5 companies, to the people who worked at them, to the families of the people who had worked at them. And those days were hard. She did not talk about those days with many people. She talked about them with Reed. That had happened gradually. These things usually do. It hadn't been a decision exactly, more like a series of small moments where the alternative was saying nothing to someone who might understand, and saying nothing increasingly felt like choosing a more difficult kind of alone. He had called her the week after the arrest to check how the wound was healing, because he had been the one who stopped the bleeding on Decker Street, and that created a sense of ongoing investment in the outcome. She had answered the question directly and then asked him something. He couldn't remember now what it was. Something small, something about the shop or Hallie, or how Blackridge felt different in the aftermath. And they had talked for an hour and a half, and afterward Reed had sat in his kitchen with the phone still in his hand, aware that something had shifted and not entirely certain how to categorize it. Hallie had no such uncertainty. Hallie processed the new configuration of their lives with the decisive pragmatism of a child who has always trusted her own observations more than the adults around her. Celeste visited the shop once, in early December, to sign some legal documents that Birch had needed Reed's address for. Hallie was there after school, doing homework at the desk in the back office with the kind of focused inefficiency that meant she was mostly drawing in the margins. She had looked up when Celeste came in, watched the document signing with mild interest, and then said, "Do you know how to bake anything?" Celeste had looked at her. "Why?" "Dad can't bake," Hallie said. "He tries, but things come out wrong. Last year he made my birthday cake and it was flat on one side." "In my defense," Reed said from across the shop, "the pan was defective." "The pan was fine," Hallie said to Celeste. "He just doesn't know how to bake." Celeste had said carefully that she knew how to make a few things. Hallie had said that she wanted to learn to make something with a layer, meaning a layered cake. The conversation had taken 14 minutes, and by the end of it, they had made a plan that was not quite an arrangement and not quite an appointment, but was something, and Reed had stood in the bay doorway listening to it happen and had felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, which was the particular warmth of watching the people he loved occupy the same space without effort. He had not said the word love to himself in that context. Not yet. He had said it in his general direction and then moved away from it because he was a man who had lost the person he loved in the most absolute way possible at 31, and the distance between him and that loss was 6 years, which was long enough to function and not quite long enough to stop being afraid of what happened when you let someone matter to you that much again. But the distance had been closing. He could feel it closing, which was terrifying in the specific way that things are terrifying when you want them and are afraid of wanting them simultaneously. It was Hallie who resolved this, in the way that Hallie resolved things, which was by simply stating the obvious without apparent awareness that it was supposed to be complicated. She did it on a Saturday evening in February, when Reed had forgotten to close the garage before dark, and Celeste had come by. She came by sometimes now, not always with a reason, which Reed had stopped asking about and started simply accepting. And they were sitting outside in the cold on the 2 plastic chairs that Reed kept by the garage door, with coffee cups that had gone cold 15 minutes earlier, and the specific comfortable silence of people who have been through something significant together and have arrived, without quite planning it, at the other side. Hallie appeared in the garage doorway behind them. She looked at her father. She looked at Celeste. She looked at the two of them sitting in the particular way that people sit when they are near each other in a way they haven't fully acknowledged. "You know you're in love with each other, right?" she said. Neither adult answered immediately. The silence went on for long enough that it became, itself, an answer. Hallie went back inside. Reed looked at his cold coffee. "Your daughter," Celeste said. "Yeah." "She's not wrong." Reed looked at her. The garage light was on behind them, casting a yellow rectangle across the driveway, and Celeste was sitting in the cold February evening with her coat collar turned up and her hands around a coffee cup that had been cold for a quarter of an hour and an expression that was entirely without performance of any kind. "No," he said. "She's not." He reached over and put his hand over hers on the coffee cup, which was a small and specific action that contained, in its smallness and specificity, everything that the situation required. She turned her hand over and held his. They sat in the cold for another 20 minutes, not talking, watching the street, which was the ordinary street it always had been. The dry cleaner threatening closure. The sandwich shop dark at this hour. The lights of the residential blocks beyond. The bare winter trees. The ordinary accumulated texture of a life in a place that had been the right place for no deliberate reason and had simply, over time, become his. They married in October, 13 months after the morning on Decker Street. The ceremony was small. Family, people who had been part of what happened, people who mattered. Danny came up from Providence with his wife and his 2 kids. Birch was there. Alvaro, who had never once asked what had happened in his restaurant that Tuesday in November, brought a loaf of bread as a gift and pressed Reed's hand at the door with the solemnity of a man who has decided that some things don't require words. Costa did not come. She was working something in another state, but sent a card that was 3 sentences long and exactly right. Hallie stood between Reed and Celeste in every photograph, not because anyone arranged it, but because she placed herself there naturally, as if she had been deciding where she belonged and had arrived at the answer without difficulty. Celeste kept the company. That surprised some people. Several board members had quietly suggested in the aftermath of the arrests and the public attention that a transition of leadership might ease the story's passage out of the news cycle. Celeste had listened to this suggestion with the full attention she gave to proposals she had already decided against. She had rebuilt the financial oversight architecture with people she had chosen for competence rather than loyalty, which she now understood were not the same quality. She had established an employee equity program that her previous CFO had argued against for 3 years on grounds she now recognized as deliberate obstruction. She had done the work of understanding her own company from the level of its actual operations rather than its executive summary, which was humbling in several ways she had not anticipated and more useful than anything she had done in the previous 5 years. She was not, after all of it, a different person. She was a clearer version of who she had been. There was a distinction, and it mattered. Reed expanded the shop. Not dramatically. One additional bay, 2 new lifts, a back office that no longer had evidence tape on the walls. He started a workforce training program in partnership with a veterans outreach organization in the region, which offered mechanical certification to former service members making the transition to civilian work. It had begun as a small thing, 6 participants in the first cohort, and had grown in the way that things grow when they address an actual need. Steadily, without fanfare, because the people who needed it found it and showed up. Marcus stayed. He also, in the 3rd year, became a certified instructor in the training program, which he approached with the precise combination of competence and nerves that Reed recognized as the signature of someone doing something that matters to them for the first time. Hallie got her layered cake. She got it on her 9th birthday, made in Celeste's kitchen with a degree of collaborative baking that resulted in 1 very good cake and 1 countertop that required significant cleaning, and she ate 2 slices and declared it better than anything from a bakery, which was almost certainly not true and was entirely the point. The things that Reed had lost. Sonia, the years of believing that what he could offer Hallie was simply his physical presence and his vigilance and his willingness to maintain the ordinary shape of their days. He did not recover them, because you don't recover what you've lost. You carry it. You carry it, and eventually the carrying becomes part of how you move through the world, rather than something separate from your motion, and there is a kind of integration in that which is not the same as healing and is also not nothing. He had learned that. He had also learned, and this was the thing that surprised him, the thing he had not expected to be the lesson, that the man he had put away, the one with the training and the instincts and the ability to run toward gunfire when everything else was running away from it, had not been something to retire from. It had been something to integrate. You didn't become a different person when you took off the uniform. You took that person and you brought him to a repair shop in Black Ridge, Massachusetts, and you raised your daughter, and you fixed other people's cars, and sometimes, rarely, but sometimes, the world required the full version of you, and that was not a failure of the ordinary life you'd been trying to build. It was the proof that it was real, because a life that only existed in the absence of difficulty was not a life that had been tested, and a man who was only capable of running toward bullets and not of sitting across a kitchen table from his daughter doing homework in the margins of her notebook. That man was not complete either. The complete version was both. It had always been both. He understood that now. He understood it the way you understand things that you can only see clearly after the fact. Looking back at the sequence, the shooting on Decker Street, the hotel alcove, the interrogation room, the farmhouse, the harbor, the cold February evening in plastic chairs outside a garage, and seeing not a series of events that happened to him, but a line, a thread running through, connecting the man he had been to the man he was. Reed Callahan had run into Gunfire on a Tuesday morning because someone was hurt and there was no one else moving, and he had been trained to assess a situation and act on the assessment, and everything else was detail. He had not run toward Celeste. He had run toward a stranger in need of help. The stranger had turned out to be someone who would, in time, become the person he sat outside garages with in February, saying nothing, which was its own language and one he had not expected to learn again. He was grateful for the imprecision of it. The way it had arrived, unscheduled, undignified, complicated by investigations and bullet wounds and court testimony, and an 8-year-old who cut through pretense like it was tissue paper. Nothing about it had been clean or cinematic or delivered at the right moment. All of it had been tangled up with terrible things. That was how the good things came usually, not separately, not in the gaps between the hard parts. Tangled right in with them, requiring you to hold both simultaneously, asking you to be large enough to contain the loss and the gratitude at the same time. He was. He was large enough for that now. Some evenings, when the shop was closed and Hallie was at the table doing homework, and Celeste was in the chair by the window reading something she would want to tell him about later, Reed would stand in the kitchen doorway for a moment before they noticed him. He would just stand there. He was not thinking about anything specific in those moments. He was not reviewing the past or planning the future. He was simply present in the room, aware of what was in it, the homework and the reading and the bad overhead light he kept meaning to replace, and the coffee maker that had been replaced twice now and still produced coffee that was merely adequate, and aware that what was in the room was his, in the impermanent and therefore precious way that things are yours, when you have understood that nothing is permanent and have decided to love it anyway. The swing set in the backyard came down in the second spring. Hallie helped dismantle it, which she approached with the enthusiasm of someone who has been waiting a long time to use a socket wrench. When the last section was down, she stood looking at the cleared space with her hands on her hips. "We could plant something," she said. "Like what?" Reed said. Hallie thought about it. "Something that comes back," she said, "every year, so you can count on it." Reed looked at the cleared ground. He looked at his daughter. "Yeah," he said, "let's do that." They planted in April. By the following spring it had come back, as promised, as counted on, pushing up through the ground with the specific and unremarkable insistence of living things that have decided to continue.